So just a very quick video today, because although it's not available yet, it is up for pre-order this weekend, but we finally got to see the rules and updated datasheet for the shiny new drop pod models. And whilst not a huge amount has changed, let's be honest, there are a few key things to take away from the updated profile. So let's drop right into the action and take a look at what is new. As you can see from the new profile on the right and the older stats on the left, there is a lot similar here. For the same 70 points, you still get a toughness 7 3-up save model with 8 wounds. It has no movement after it has dropped in, and it's got a leadership value of 6. The big change on the stats front is the drop of OC down from 2 to 0. This is a fairly big and significant change. It means that your drop pods can no longer be sneaky little objective holders whilst your embarked unit goes off to do other things later on in the game. It also means that some things like actions won't be possible because you can't do that with an OC of 0, although it is worth remembering some secondaries can still be done. This drop to OC 0 doesn't mean you can no longer do any secondaries with them. There are some, like behind enemy lines, that just require you to have units in various parts of the board, not to actually do actions. So they can still claim you some secondaries with this new datasheet, which is nice. I just think overall they are broadly less useful than they were previously, especially if you were just hoping to use them to drop down onto an objective, get your unit out to go and shoot and move off somewhere else, and just have your drop pod stay on that objective, scoring you points until the enemy dealt with it. The other big change, and one we did know was coming, is that the weapons are all gone, so no more Stormbolter or Deathwind missile launcher. They are not huge losses really. You are essentially losing around 1 wound onto something like a Marine profile in the best case scenario. So, I mean, having those guns wasn't nothing, it was worth shooting them, but I don't think that change is going to make or break this unit. So straight off the bat, on the face of it, 2 nerfs immediately apparent, which for the same points cost does feel bad, but it's not all bad news. The drop pods have also had some amendments in their main abilities, with their old combined rule of drop pod assault being updated and essentially expanded into 3 separate rules of drop pod assault, combat disembarkation, and deployment complete. Now, these essentially do the same things as the old drop pod assault. Your drop pod starts in reserves and it can be set up in the reinforcement step of your first, second, or third battle round. It does still have deep strike, so it can come anywhere on the board 9 inches away from enemies when it does arrive. Your unit does have to immediately disembark. You don't have a choice, it must disembark, and your disembarked unit must also be set up 9 inches from all enemies as well, so that hasn't changed. The deployment complete rule is just one that clarifies after your units have disembarked from the drop pod, nothing can get back into it, so you can't hop a unit back into it to keep it safe or something like that. Essentially, the drop pod comes in, your units have to get out, and then the drop pod is just there for the rest of the battle doing its own thing. But where there is a little bit of a new thing in the rules is the combat disembarkation rule. This gives drop pods essentially an assault ramp style rule, so you can make a charge with your unit even after it's disembarked. Normally you wouldn't be able to do this because your transport has counted as having moved, so on things like your impulses and the like, you can get out after it's moved, but you can't then charge. Now drop pods, kind of like land raiders, allow you to do that, so even after this thing has moved, you can disembark and you can still charge. So with this, the ability to drop in your first turn reinforcement step, you can potentially get a turn 1 charge with, say, a unit of assault intercessors or blade guard veterans that are coming down in the drop pod. So that does potentially add some melee threat that you can throw down into the enemy's face really early on in the game. The big issue with it, of course, is that you are still restricted by having to set up 9 inches away. So even after you've deployed the drop pod and disembarked your unit, you are still going to be having to make a 9-inch charge. So unless you've got some way to boost your charge rolls, even with a command point reroll, it is still very, very unlikely that you're going to make it in. So it's a cool clarification, and it does give you, as I said, some melee threat right out of the gate. It's just a very unreliable way to get units in combat, but if you really need and want to get some turn 1 charges off, this can help add some more threat overload that you can throw at the enemy. The final new change to the profile of the drop pod is in the transport capacity itself, which has had a very welcome change from 10 all the way up to 12. Now, it still can't transport Terminator, Jump Pack, Wolfen, Centurion, or Gravis models, but anything from Intercessors to Hellblasters to Blade Guard veterans to Stern Guard veterans, they are all fair game. And this can mean now that you can put a whole 10-man squad and an attached character, in some cases even 2 attached characters if you're putting a chapter master or a captain with them, which is something a lot of people really wanted, because it now allows you to put a really scary shooter unit with some really nice buffs on it right down in the enemy deployment zone and just unleash a load of firepower into a key enemy unit. And for me, this change alone is a huge boost to the usefulness of drop pods. Immediately, things like 10 Hellblasters or 10 Stern Guard can be made much more effective by putting characters like Azrael or a Lieutenant for those sustained or lethal hits. Even something like an Apothecary to keep a unit that you've dropped in alive for a bit longer does give them so much more viability. And, just as a quick example, you could go for the Gladius Task Force, put a Lieutenant in with the Fire Discipline enhancement. That gives your unit both lethal and sustain hits. So for that extra 90 points, you can take a squad of Hellblasters from doing around 8 damage to an Imperial Knight profile to about 14. So you can almost double their output by just having that extra space in the drop pod. And whilst it may not be the most cost-effective use of a unit, I know that you are essentially using these guys as a suicide unit, but it can make it much more threatening or take out some light or medium vehicles that maybe the enemy were really banking on and relying on for their battle plan. So even if you aren't quite making your points back, the fact that you can now much more reliably disrupt your opponent's battle plans in some way can make that trade-off much better than it initially appears in some situations. You've got other great examples like the Librarius Conclave, which used to be a really popular option with the Stern Guard. Now you can put 10 Stern Guard and a Librarian in the pod, and they can now not only get a 4-up invuln from the Librarian, but for that grand total of 370 points with the drop pod, the Stern Guard, and the Librarian, you can be throwing out 24 strength 4 -1 AP 1 damage shots that are dev wounds on a 5+ against monsters and vehicles, plus an extra 6 strength 5 -1 AP 2 damage shots with the same 5+ crit wounds, and also re-rolling all hit and wound rolls against your oath target. So that unit, against the same Imperial Knight profile from before, should on average kill off a new 26 wound knight profile. So it is a very pricey investment, and as I said, it won't always necessarily make its points back, but if you can use a unit to ruin a key piece of your enemy's battle plan, being able to take out that important knight on a flank or Angron or something like that, can really change the game in your favor, even if you are slightly less well off in terms of the points trade, just because that unit was so key to how their army was going to perform and how their battle plan was going to progress. Overall, drop pods are still drop pods. They haven't changed much, and they aren't exactly storming the meta at the moment. I don't think that is going to change, to be honest, especially with the drop to their 0 OC, meaning they are much less good at sort of objective and scoring play. But just that small change of being able to add in a supporting character or two to a 10-man unit can mean that for some players anyway, and maybe some less competitive, more fun games, that full Hellblaster or Stern Guard or Inferno squad can now be made much more effective by adding a character in, and certainly against some armies in some of your groups with friends or whatever it may be, that can make a big difference. Getting 10d6 Pyreblaster shots with an extra pip of AP in the Librarius Conclave, as well as anti-monster or anti-vehicle 5+, or maybe an extra 6 inches of range in the Telekinesis discipline, can make throwing them into a list a very fun and tempting addition. As I said, you do run the risk with this because drop pods are not exactly cheap at 70 points, so you do run the risk of putting too many eggs in one basket. But for me, I just think the main takeaway is we've got some cool updated models. They are, as I said, a little worse for objective play now, but I personally love the idea of bringing this souped up unit to try and one-shot an important enemy piece. And with things like Hellblasters and Sternguard especially, with some of the characters and enhancements you can put on characters to join with them now and put them all in the same pod, they can be much, much, much better at doing that. The last little addition in this new profile and datasheet is this image that you can see on your screen now, which is just GW's way to help players identify exactly what counts as the hull of the unit. So it's just a nice way to let players see where models can, end moves and what pieces actually count as part of the drop pod, or which parts of it just count as sort of the scenic base it has. So that's nice to see. I do think it's a good thing to add so that we can be really clear and avoid any arguments or need for FAQs in the future. I do hope they do this sort of thing going forward if they release any other models that have slightly weird or unique designs or bases or profiles and that sort of thing. It just makes things run a bit more smoothly and easily when you're playing either in tournaments or just with your friends. And that is going to be it for today. As I said, it was going to be a short video, but I'd love to know what you make of these new drop pod rules. Do you think they are better or worse than they were before? And which units are you going to be trying out first with them? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later guys.